Exhausted contestants sprint to the finish mat at the bottom of the world. No one expects to be greeted by a tall man in a black suit and tie and a serious look, surrounded by hundreds of sheep. The fate of each couple lies in the words about to come from his eldest son's mouth. He's mostly known by reality TV fans as the greeter of Amazing Race 13 in New Zealand, and had his 15 seconds of fame with the following line. "Hi, I'm Phil's dad. Welcome to New Zealand."
I knew I couldn't go back.
You
just put it out there.
She said you've got less than a year to live.
Just dug even
Luck
deeper.
is the residue of design.
Nobody else was doing it, so why couldn't I?
That was the turning point.
Welcome to the BUCKiT podcast with Phil Keoghan. Every week I talk to mavericks, disruptors, and innovators. People who ditch the excuses, swerve off the predictable road, and epitomize what it means to tick it before you kick it. He's known me longer than anyone except my mum, and he's the reason I have a lust for travel, adventure, and meeting people. In this podcast, Dad gives me some fatherly words of advice and why it's important to remember my humble Kiwi roots. Okay, here we go. A bit of a chat with Dad. What do you think is the best advice you've ever given me, Dad, in my life?
I think the best advice is to be yourself, to treat everyone the way you would like to be treated, not to have sides when it comes to treating people and judging people. Be open-minded. I think the sort of qualities that your mum brought you up with more than anything else.
Yeah, Mum would always say, always try to find the good in people.
Yes, I think your
And
mum...
I remember that.
Yeah, your mum was unique in never having sides, biased sides, always treating people equally and judging from an equal basis.
Yeah.
And also, I think the other thing is that your mum's probably the most unselfish person I've ever come across.
Yeah.
And I see those qualities rubbing off in you and Ruth and Andrew as well.
Oh. I do listen to the things you and Mum say, you know. I do think of the things that you've said. I think for me, the best gift that you and Mum ever gave us as kids was the fact that you taught us to be accepting of others, and also just to see the good in what people are doing. Like focus on what's right instead of what's wrong. And the fact that we got to travel at such an early age, I think taught all of us to be very adaptable in any circumstance and comfortable with anybody, whether they're a prime minister or whether they're a local farmer on the island of Antigua. Like there was an approach that you and Mum had, which is where the door always seemed to be open to anybody. There was no judgment about their sexuality, their race, or anything, and that definitely rubbed off on your three kids. So let's talk about where, because my love of travel came from you and Mum. You know, because I started traveling so early with you. You and Mum decide that you're going to take your family to Canada. We lived there for what, about 3 years or something?
Just over 3 years.
3 years, and you're lecturing at Guelph University.
I was doing mainly research and some lecturing at Guelph. And in Canada, we joined a Canadian aid organisation. We always wanted to work under more third world conditions.
What was the desire to do that?
Well, a new challenge, and life was so comfortable in Canada. We thought, in fact, I went to Ottawa to interview for a job. When I got to Ottawa, they said, "Oh, John, we've got you here on false pretenses. We've been looking for 13 months for someone to start the forage legging project in the Eastern Caribbean. We cannot find a West Indian. Would you be interested?" I said, "Oh, yes. Oh, yes." And so I was able to...
You felt like a bit of a pioneer in your field?
Absolutely. That project, the forage legging project, I started without any land, without any plants, without any staff, and without any infrastructure. So
See-
what an
see-
incredible opportunity.
See, this is the thing that I admire most about you and Mum. And when I think back on what I learned from you and Mum, I remember Mum being a teacher at Princess Margaret High School. She was asked to teach on the other side of the island. I think it was in Bethesda. We had this we had a Ford Escort.
A beat-up Ford Escort.
A two-door, beat-up green Ford Escort. And I remember Mum getting Ruth and I, my sister, to carry all the typewriters out of Princess Margaret High School, out of the classroom, load them into the back of the Ford Escort,
Yes.
drive clear across the other side of the island.
That's
It's a
right.
108 square mile island. We'd go clear across the other side of the island, unload all the typewriters. She'd teach the class until the sun went down. We'd load them all back into the Ford again and drive them back across to the other.
back to
Princess
the
Margaret.
university centre where she taught.
Oh, she used to do that too. I forgot.
Yes.
Yeah, but I remember the thing that I remember most is just that neither one of you ever said something couldn't be done. You were you're both incredibly stubborn people. You're both Taurus and two of the most stubborn people I've met, but in a good way, because I always feel like you always start with not that something can't be done, but it's more like how can it be done, and that I think is rubbed off on the three of us as kids.
Yes, I would think so. And the other thing is that you and Ruth had to show incredible flexibility because we kept getting visitors, technical and otherwise, and half the time you weren't sleeping in your beds because someone was there. And then you had to share the house every day because your mum ended up with so many piano students that she had to give up the secondary school and just go flat out with 50 piano students, and then she developed the theory classes and used classrooms after school hours.
But there was, what I loved about it, Dad? There was always this great energy in the house. So we'd always have these interesting people to visit. And
indeed.
And then the story of Mum when she picks up the sailors on the side of the road to come back to the house to do their washing. You remember that one?
Yes, that's right. They were off a Canadian submarine and they were looking for a laundromat. And Beth said, she said, come on, hop in the car and you can come and use our washing machine.
I remember sitting in the car being embarrassed that Mum was stopping to talk to these
she would always stop.
soldiers.
She would stop and pick up Antiguan women, walking along the road in order to go and clean someone else's house.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing was that your mum was teaching at home and trying to get some pizzas made.
Yeah.
And anyway, the guys offered to help. And then after your mum resisted, finally they said, ma'am, this man is a chef, and just if you don't mind, we will take over. And they cut everything your mum had cut up, they cut finer, and they made the pizzas.
I remember them throwing them in the kitchen.
Oh, absolutely. And then they took us down and took us on board the submarine. Late at night.
Yeah, I remember that. And the other day, Dad, I met a gentleman who's the headmaster of the Barbudan High School.
Yes.
And he told me that the reason he went away from Antigua to go and study science was because he met you at the sugarcane factory where you'd set up your project. And he distinctly remembered, the thing he remembered is one of the things that I remember, where, like you said, you didn't have resources, you didn't have a staff, you didn't have a location, and you're meant to be propagating plants. You didn't have nurseries. So what did you do? You're at an old sugarcane factory. What did you do?
Well, I decided that would be the best place for me inside the compound, and then I thought, well, what better way to do experimental work and to grow on plants than protected, because there were goats wandering around, protected within these railway trucks, sugar trucks.
Now, just as an observation, one of the things that made a lot of sense was that the top of the tray on the railway truck was right at waist level. So all the plants were right when you were watering, when you were working with them.
I could back my pickup truck in and load, but not only that, we use it for nutrient response experiments, nitrogen fixation experiments. I could roll them backwards and forwards. I cleared the area so I could roll them backwards and forwards. I had a water supply.
You know what they call that, Dad, don't you?
Innovation, Phil.
Innovation.
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 Or in Indonesia, in Bahasa Improvisasi.
And you spent a bit of time in Indonesia.
I spent a lot of time in Indonesia.
But Dad, where did you get, and I know Mum is the same way, it's the way that your brains, both of you, again, you're problem solvers. When you're faced with something, you immediately go into, and those are the people that I've been attracted to in my life, my good friends. Scott, who's shooting here, I'm attracted to people who...
Well, Scott Shelley can make something out of almost nothing.
Exactly.
Improvising.
It's the way that some people start with, oh, we've got a problem, they throw their hands up in the air, and then they start to identify what the problem is and label it. And then there's others that immediately go into, we have a challenge here, how do we fix it? And you and Mum have that in spades, and I'm just wondering, for you, where did that come from?
Well, I think it came from my upbringing, and you see, one of the good things about, I think, many New Zealanders is that we're hands-on people, and you notice the difference when you go overseas. I remember working in my nursery, quite a bit of time after I got things set up, and two of the old watchmen who were on the gate of the compound came over to me and said to me, "We have never seen a white man working like this physically," because I was pouring sweat. In fact, I was clearing the area to...
This is when you were first setting up.
It was, yes. Looking back, it was earlier. And I said, well, probably the Prime Minister of New Zealand cuts his own hedge. Or they said, all we've seen is the white man come in chauffeur-driven in a car.
Yeah.
I said, but that's not the way of
that's
the
not the
world
way of,
in many situations. Yeah. And I think they learned a lot, and I learned a lot from them, from the reaction.
But you've always been a believer too, and I know Mum is the same, is to just roll up your sleeves and lead the way, meaning show the way and show that you're prepared to do what you're asking anybody else to do. Yeah. Meaning that there's that both of you don't have these. I guess you don't make up rules about who does what. It's whatever it takes to get the job done, isn't it?
I think so. And I chose some staff from scratch, and then I worked with them day in, every day for probably the first 2 years, setting the standards and setting the pace. So it was a time of just progress, with limited time and limited resources, limited finances, but making do.
You remember that favorite quote from Sir Ernest Rutherford? He said, "We didn't have money, so we had to think."
Absolutely.
And I think that quote really does epitomize the way most New Zealanders think. One of my early memories of starting out, Dad, was fixing up a $100 motorbike that I bought from the neighbor across the road that didn't work.
That's right.
It was a Taka.
It was an unusual Czech.
It was some
Polish or Czech or something.
Taka or something.
Yes, Taka.
Terrible motorbike. Sorry, the people of Czech Republic or wherever that was from. Might have even been Turkish or something. I'm not sure. But it wasn't
I think you're floundering.
It wasn't a prized motorbike. And it had all these rusty pieces. And I took the bike to bits, and then I got all of the rusty pieces electroplated. Do you remember that? And there was a nice little finish on them. Then we got the motor running again, and the top speed on that motorbike was 25 miles an hour. Except when a truck went by. Right. And when a truck went by, you'd get pulled into the vacuum of the back of the 18-wheeler, and all of a sudden you were doing 40. And you were barely hanging on, in the back like this.
And you rode it all the way to Christchurch.
Well, so that was the day that I left home.
Yes.
And the second time, because I first left home when I came all the way back to New Zealand for school. And I had that backpack, which weighed at least half as much as me, and I left home with everything going up the hill out of Mosgiel. Didn't know if I was even going to make it out of the hills out of Dunedin, and it took me 10 and a half hours to ride 367 kilometers all the way to this flat where I was renting a room.
That's right.
And I felt like that day was. It was a pivotal day. It was when I realized, oh boy, I'm really out in the world by myself now. Mm-hmm. So, Dad, you just turned 76.
I turned 76.
When you think you're 76, what goes through your mind?
Well, I figure I've got a lot more years left. And a lot more things to do. I've got things I want to do.
What's on
I
your...
told you I want to go to Iceland.
Okay. What else would you like to do, Dad?
Or do the old Ghost Road with you.
Yep, which is over
which is a new walkway in our home area on the west coast of the South Island.
Okay. Any desire to go to space? Because that's something that's on my list.
No, certainly not, Phil. No, that might be for you. No, I like my feet firmly on the ground. No bungee jumping or anything like that.
Now, being 76, Dad, what advice do you want to give me?
Oh, keep including us the way you do. I think that's, you see, I think the most important thing to us is family. And I think that just as I was fortunate finding Beth, you were very fortunate finding Louise. I think, sometimes synergies are so obvious. So 1 and 1 with you equals 4. And so, but the other thing, not just Louise's energy and skills, but the fact is we've always felt so included by her. And that's so important.
Well, I want to thank you for saying yes to things all the time, because you and Mum are yes people, and I love being around people who start with yes rather than start with no. Dad, if you could drive across America with anybody from any period in history, anybody, who would you have in the car with you for a trip across America for, say, 10 days?
Well, you, of course.
Well, Dad, you don't have to pick me. You could pick someone else. You've had a trip across there with me. What about Kerry Takanawa or Nelson Mandela?
I think Barack Obama.
Okay.
Or Nelson Mandela.
Yeah.
I would say I'd certainly welcome having them there. Good company.
Yeah, when you're around people you want to be with, time almost stands still, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
It's just that great feeling.
Absolutely.
Thank you for always saying yes to coming on adventures, Dad. All right, and then another question I have for you is, can you remember the last time you laughed so hard you cried? I've seen you cry a few times from laughing.
I've cried a few times from crying as well.
Well, we all have.
And I think the last time I really cried was when we had our 50th wedding anniversary, and Andrew sang that song for us, Neil Young's Harvest Moon.
Yes.
Oh.
But were you crying it was crying in a good way, right?
Oh, in a good way, yes. Yeah, but it was so emotional. Laughing, you'd have to remind me.
Well, Dad, I've seen you do it a lot of times. But if it doesn't come to mind, then I like the idea that you cried at your 50th wedding anniversary because Andrew, my brother, your son, brought you to tears in a good way.
In a good way.
And Dad, the last question is, if you were going to take your last breath tomorrow, you knew you were going to take your last breath tomorrow at midnight, what would you do with your last day on Earth?
I'd just gather everyone around. Tell them I love them, because I think there's a lot of love in our family. We're demonstrative. Mm-hmm. We express our feelings. We're great huggers.
Yeah.
We are able to take the mickey out of each other.
Yeah.
And
well,
keep
it's sort of part of
smiling.
The whole. Yeah, it's part of the whole culture of our family.
And we enjoy each other's company. And I think that's one of the key things for us as parents, is seeing just how close our 3 children are, and our daughter-in-law and our son-in-law. It's a very, very close family unit.
Dad, thanks for taking some time to talk to me. And you know I love you.
Love you too.
Yeah.
And Louise. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very special to us.
All right. Thank you, Dad.
Thank you.
You can watch this podcast online at philkeoghan.com. And let me know what's on your bucket list. You never know. You might be my next guest. Don't forget, tick it before you kick it.